Hi everybody, I'm James Meese from RMIT University, and I'll be moderating this next panel called Journalism and Automated Decision Making from Hype to Reality. I'm really lucky, and we're really lucky to be joined by a range of leading researchers and practitioners who are really kind of at the cutting edge, either in terms of their study or their kind of practice when it comes to the rollout of automated decision-making in journalism. So from my left, we have Silvia Montananino, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the ADM+S and is also based at QUT. We have Professor Wiebke Loosen from the Hans Bredau Institute in Hamburg, who's an expert on journalism. We have Nick Evershed, data journalist at Guardian Australia. We have Inga Ting, a data journalist at ABC, and we have Damiano Spina, the DECRA Fellow and ADM+S member at RMIT University, and Professor Haiqing Yu, Future Fellow, ARC Future Fellow, and a professor at RMIT University as well. I'll say a few words and then I'll pass over to our panel. One of the major reasons ADM+S was set up is to really engage with a few sectors that are rapidly embracing and engaging with automation. And it should come as no surprise to us that the news sector is one of those kind of critical areas. We know that the last 2 to 3 decades, it's really been news and the media industry more generally has been at the interface of a lot of digital transformation. So when automation has come around, it's clear that news is going to be a critical part of this. Obviously, a common theme that I think we see a lot is the emergence and perhaps the fear of the robot journalist, the computational production of text, potentially taking journalists' jobs, a worry for a sector that's already under so much financial stress. But of course, as the title suggests, we think there's a lot more to that story in terms of automated decision-making, a lot more interesting things going on, and we don't want to just check out the challenges, but also look at the potential opportunities for reporting, and also just see more generally how not just one technology, but a range of technologies are being deployed across the news media sector. So with that, I'll turn to the first panelist to my left, Silvia. You're in the middle of an Australian-wide study looking at automated technologies and seeing how they're used in Australian newsrooms. We'll get to the kind of guts of that research later, but maybe just to start us off and to get the room grounded, could you tell us what sort of technologies are commonly used in newsrooms, the kind of technologies you've come across?
Yes, thank you, James, and welcome everyone. Yes, last year started a study about how automation was applied in Australian newsrooms, and sort of investigating if there is this set of set and forget tools where journalists definitely didn't intervene in the production of news, or there were like more human efforts to sort of carry out the automation in journalism. So first, I start with mapping the different tools and technologies that are used in Australian newsrooms. So there is a variety there, and of course, in different editorial stages, these sort of cultures of editorial automation are more developed than in others. So for the Australian case, for example, it's very important to consider all the culture of delivering news and recommending news, because of course this is part of the economic interest of the organizations, now sort of in the interest of finding the audiences. So there is like a very important sort of culture of delivering the news. And this is part of these tools designed for these tasks are sort of the set and forget. So for example, in the area of audience engagement, the people working in this area, they don't need like any more sort of manual work to distribute content across social media platforms. So they are like more automated and scheduled let's say, social media posting tools for that, for the distribution of news. In terms of recommendation, of course, all the organizations are working in algorithmic ranking and trying to gather sort of a readership data to understand audiences. So this is done by or through algorithmic ranking. And in contrast to that side of the distribution of news, there is another important area of development, which is the automated data visualization side. And this is like working as the first sort of model of automating news via infographics or charts. And this was very important, or there were very important models, especially during COVID-19 and the bushfires, where journalists tried and worked with different open source tools or software, and they created these stories collecting data just to show it in visual ways. And there are other more popular, sort of mundane, but with lots of artificial intelligence in the middle, and accessible for every journalist in the newsrooms. And is the area of the transcripts apps. So this is sort of like a commercial thing, and every journalist, it's a commercial thing because it's like a service that the outlets just buy for the staff. So journalists use these apps, of course, for covering news and transcribing the news with when they have like contact with different sources. So this is like the most like popular level, like every journalist has the automated transcript. So we have like different areas of development, and some more developed than others, and but slowly in a transition towards automation more and more. I would have some comments about computer-generated text, but I guess Nick here is going to develop a little bit more on that because, yeah, he knows more.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. A really great array of technologies from in-house to commercial, and it's really fascinating to see how they kind of interact together. But yes, a wonderful preview as well, so we can move on to Nick now. And I know we want to get beyond the hype and beyond these kind of standard models, but you know, I do feel it's worth talking about ReporterMate, which you created in 2019. And you know, I guess it's an early experiment in whatever we might call it, AI or ADM. Could you just talk a bit behind your kind of thinking behind that experiment?
Sure. So ReporterMate was an experiment in automating actual writing of news. So it wasn't anything sophisticated. It wasn't like involving machine learning or algorithmic models like, you know, your GPT-3 or anything like that. It was quite simply a way for taking stories that were based on data sets and turning that into text. And so this is something that I frequently have to do in my job anyway as a data journalist. So it might be doing the analysis of some data, figuring out the results and the interesting things, and then writing the copy of the news story. So the idea with ReporterMate was just to automate that whole process and essentially like make a system that did the analysis, the text templating, and so on, so you could run it all in one go. So data in and then news story out. And it worked. It was a very rudimentary system, but it worked fine. It worked fine enough to use it in production a few times. We used it for political donation stories a couple of times, just because there are certain stories where the data comes out and you want to get a story up very quickly. Because in news, if you have a story online very quickly, you get more engagement, more traffic, more interest, and then you can add to it as time goes on. You can get the humans in, do the analysis of like actual interesting donors and all that sort of stuff. So what we did is we just set it up so as soon as the donations data comes out, we press a button and then the story's generated immediately. We do a few checks just to make sure all the data's in the right place, there's no mistakes, and all that sort of thing. And you get a very simple summary story, which is like the highest donors from each party, the total donors, are donations up, are they down, that sort of thing. So it worked fine, and it could be used more if we had the time to develop it and the interest in the time to develop it. We've thought about deploying it in situations like climate emissions data, for example. There's a quarterly report which comes out all the time. We always write a story about it. So stories like that are very good candidates for automation, where it's always based on the data. You're always writing about how the data changed, so like unemployment figures, inflation, all that sort of stuff. There's a certain element of those stories which can always be automated. It's worth pointing out, though, that there is also elements of those stories which can't be automated. So like the actual impact on people, real sort of like speaking to people about, you know, what the inflation changes mean, how it's going to affect them, all that sort of stuff. You can't automate that. And it's going to be a very long time before you can automate that side of it, I think.
Right, so without wanting to editorialize too much, it seems like at this moment there's kind of a happy medium between, at least in that particular context, between the type of work that a machine is taking on and in a way freeing up journalists to do some of that more deep work.
Yeah, I think so. And there are commercial organizations who do this stuff as well. So there's like services who take in sports data, for example, and financial data and act like wire services, and they just generate the copy. But like, they're not very engaging stories in terms of reporting. They're very dry. They're very templated. There's no sophistication to like the importance of different parts of it beyond what you've selected at the start. So in terms of like the future direction of that sort of stuff, I think that's where you would bring in like a machine learning type layer to it in terms of the importance of each of the parts of the story. So you wouldn't have machine learning writing the story, but you would like use it to rank the important bits by, you know, scoring them in some fashion, which would be interesting.
Fantastic. I'll come back to you, Nick, but I wanted to move on to Ingo. And obviously we've had a bit of an early sense of what Nick's been talking about at the Guardian Australia, and Sylvia's has given us a great kind of overview of some of the technologies that are used. I just wanted to get a sense of where the ABC's at with these kind of technologies. Do you have your own fancy reporter-mate? You know, are there kind of increasing uses of these kind of automated technologies?
Sadly, we don't have our own reporter-mate yet, but there's definitely an increasing use of automated decision-making tools, particularly throughout the COVID pandemic. I think that was when we very much moved towards doing more of that kind of reporting. And that was purely a response to the need. There was, at the beginning of the pandemic, it took a team, so I work in a team of 8 people, and it took the entire team all day, every day, including weekends, to put together the stories, to follow the daily case numbers. And that was partly because the data was in such a mess when it came out. There were different definitions and methodologies between the states and territories. There was no coordination between the states and territories. You had to go to each state and territory health department to get it. There would also be conflicts between the numbers that were reported at the federal level versus state level. And it took all day to get the numbers, verify the numbers, try to work out why they didn't add up according to the previous day, and then to try to put them in a story. So we had put together a story that was basically made up of text and charts, and we were changing those manually every day. So it would take a team of 3, so 3 of us to do the data. I did the reporting. We had a developer doing the charts. Our designer was away because he was very smart. But that process went on for months and months, and it was really hard to refine that to get it to be efficient in any way and to feel like we were making any kind of headway and not just being continually swamped every day by the exact same activity. And it was incredibly frustrating. So it was the evolution of both the need to not work like 15 hours a day every day for all of us, and also the database started to be slowly cleaned up. So there was more coordination between the health departments, there was more consistency in the reporting of the numbers and the definitions being used. We had better contacts in the health departments in terms of clarifying numbers. And they started to put out actual data sets as opposed to just random numbers announced sometimes in a press conference or sometimes in a PDF or sometimes on a website that would then change later on. And so once they had the data side more organized and more consistent, then we were able to think about how we could be more organized and more efficient in the way that we picked up that data and used it. So, I mean, I think it was still into a year maybe into the pandemic when we started using more scraped data sets. And actually, it's not someone at the ABC, it's an amazing person outside the ABC whose scraped data sets we use. And we kind of merged the manual data set that we were collecting with the scraped data to create a story that now works mostly on automated custom text. So I've still written the template where all the custom numbers go, but in that text, there's missing words, basically, which is where it just plugs in the number. So it might be, today in Australia, X number of cases were announced in X number of states and territories, X number of health departments are still to report. These are the hospitalizations, this is the trend, that kind of thing. And that freed up an enormous amount of time. So obviously there was a huge process in switching to that, so we had to kind of do the manual work at the same time as trying to switch everything over. But we knew it would be worth it because we just couldn't do any other news. And an entire team being taken up with this one project, it wasn't one project, we did many stories out of that, but this one topic that was all-consuming was just not efficient. And also it meant that we really had to ask at the ABC, like, is this what you want us to do? And how long do you want us to do it for? And how important is this coverage? Because as interest in the pandemic kind of waxed and waned with the different waves, after the first wave, they were like, oh, it's done now, you can just leave it. I was like, I really don't think that people will be pleased if we just leave this. We still had hundreds of people going to those stories every day. The main story with the article has had tens of millions of views and still attracts hundreds of people depending on what's going on in the news today. And I was like, also at the ABC, it's a public broadcaster. We have a duty to report on this, even if it's not the top story of the day. We can't just abandon this. And also, if we abandon this data set, we cannot go back and just get the numbers. You cannot go back. If this comes up again and we have interest in the numbers, we can't fill in those blanks. You have to be on this unless we automate it. So it kind of meant that we could also be in the story and on the story without spending all of our time on it, even if it wasn't the top story of the day. And setting up that framework and that structure meant that we could apply it to a whole lot of other structures. So that's how we did the vaccination statistics almost from the beginning. And also because the government was much more organised, at least it took them only a couple of months to get organised around the vaccination statistics as opposed to a year. And we were also able to do more localized stories that looked at, for instance, what are the vaccination rates or what are the case numbers and trends in your local area, because those data sets were being put out in an organized fashion. So that template of doing kind of customized text, scraping data sets, pulling the data in, and setting it up to update daily or several times a day even, and to run across months on one story, became the way that we tackled the COVID stories, and it freed up our team to do other stories. So then we were actually able to do other work during the year. But it did raise some interesting questions about then, once it's automated, whose job is it to keep that story, to maintain it? Do you still need a reporter to do that? Or is that then more like sort of a junior producer, or all these sorts of questions. And obviously there's still a human element where you need to verify the data and check the numbers and have a deep understanding of what those numbers mean and why they might be right or wrong, and when you need to actually then ask questions to the health departments. But it does, I think, raise really interesting questions about where that process fits in the newsroom, and how that responsibility shifts, and what kind of skill set you need to maintain a story like that versus the old school kind of story that was just put out once and not based on any kind of automation.
That's fantastic, Inga. Thank you so much. There's a great sort of story there of, obviously intense amount of hours at a critical time, a sense of gradual learning, I guess, at the ABC, and then obviously seeing it rolled out to new kind of areas. That story of building capacity, obviously, great opportunity there, but also as you're kind of flagging at the end there, some new organisational challenges too. So we might move back to Nick and move from Reporter-Mate to the election. And, you really engaged in some detailed, I guess, ADM deployment or deep learning deployment, for want of a better word. I've come to calling one of the things you built a giant check machine, but there are other more fun things that you did. So maybe you could tell us about the kind of image recognition software you deployed and, the campaign tracking that you also engaged in.
Yeah, so in the election campaign, we were interested in looking at campaign spending and promises, and we were particularly interested in trying to find evidence of pork barreling, which is discretionary political spending that's like going to specific areas based on how close the seat is or who has the seat, like the party. And to do that, we sort of slightly ambitiously decided we would try and cover every possible announcement from any major party politician, which meant collecting all of their Facebook posts, all of their media releases, and then figuring out how to classify those into things like, this is a spending announcement, this is not a spending announcement, here's how much they're promising, and here's what it's for, and all that sort of stuff. And once we got into that, and we did have like an extra person to help us out. We had a couple of great interns from the University of Melbourne who were fantastic. But even with a team of like 3 or 4 people, it was like impossible to do manually. Like Inga was saying, it would have been hours and hours and hours of work every day of the week just to keep this thing running. So we looked at automation, and we looked at classifying the text in different ways through like natural language processing. And my colleague Josh Nicholas, who is studying this stuff at university while also being a full-time journalist, came up with a kind of low-level machine learning logistic regression approach to classifying the text into this is a spending announcement or not, based on some stuff that we had done earlier. So that was incredibly helpful. It didn't get it right all the time. We still had to do a lot of manual work, but it meant that we were able to, in real time, figure out where all the spending was going and keep track of it and show that a lot of money went to marginal seats, much, much more than to other seats. And part of this, which was a really fun part for me, was looking at the photos that politicians posted as well throughout the campaign. And we had this crazy idea at the start that, it'd be great to expand the project to photos as well as text. And this sort of took a lot longer than the text and actually didn't generate, I think it only generated 1 news story, so it was quite hard to justify in retrospect. But we wanted to look at photos and say, all right, are they holding a giant novelty check? Are they giving it to someone at a bowling club, that sort of thing? Because political photo opportunities are like, bread and butter of political campaigns, particularly like the local politician sort of campaign. And then we expanded it to look at like types of photo opportunities, so like people wearing hard hats and high vis. There's like a lot of anecdotal talk about how politicians dress up a lot more than they used to, wearing high-vis vests and all that sort of stuff. And we thought, well, we can test this. We'll get all of the photos from this campaign, we'll get all of the photos from the last campaign, and then we'll run like an object recognition model, classify it to recognize high-vis, classify it to recognize novelty checks, and a few other things. So that's what we did in the end. It worked okay. It wasn't very accurate, but it was accurate enough to make it possible, which is the main thing. So it wasn't like 100% correct all the time. We actually preferred it with a low level of, what's the word? So there was a lot of false positives, but then you had to go and manually check it anyway. So you wanted to find all the photos rather than miss out on photos anyway. So yeah, we were able to find giant novelty checks. We looked at the increase and decrease of high-vis stuff, and it was very funny. Also dogs, puppies, that sort of thing.
So maybe this is a multi-year project of tracking giant checks in election campaigns, right?
Yeah.
Over decades.
Yeah. So giant checks actually went down between the two elections. They're like not as popular anymore, and I think this is in part due to all the reporting that happened in the election previous, because there was a couple of I don't want to say scandals. What's the word? Yeah. Interesting events that involve giant checks.
Great choice of words. That's fantastic. Inga, before we move on, I just wanted to, obviously you've given us a great kind of COVID story, but, is there a sense of which, the ABC engaged during the election in similar sort of work, or alternatively, do you have a sense of what happens next for the ABC in terms of these technologies?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that there's definitely an interest in doing more of this kind of work, but not a great sense of how to do it in the best way and where that work sits, I think, in the organisation. I think there's a great interest in it, but not a lot of understanding of how it's done and what it takes to do it, which I think is, a common position for lots of organisations and certainly news organisations. There's lots of questions about, well, is this about hiring somebody who's a specialist in machine learning, or is it about hiring a specialist in data analysis, or is it about just hiring straight out developers, more developers? And I think all of these questions are being asked by people who don't really understand the difference necessarily between these things either, and also without a great understanding of what it takes to compete for this kind of skill set. Even in our team, when we hire developers, it's very hard to attract great developers on the kinds of salaries that are being offered at the ABC. That's the reality, is that you're competing with the tech sector, which is, compared to the public broadcaster, I think really flush with money, and also gives people an opportunity to work in a sector that really deeply understands their work and offers them that sort of, collegial support, which I think can also be hard if you work in an organisation that's in a field that has traditionally been quite removed from your kind of work. So I think there's certainly a lot of interest, but I think there's small sections of the organisation that are doing that kind of work and really trying to engage more with it, but that can be worlds away from, the traditional kind of core of the newsroom.
Absolutely. So it sounds like we're at a kind of critical juncture, perhaps, with these kind of technologies. Now, we are going to travel around the world and talk about different technologies, but I just wanted to kind of end the Australian piece by coming back to Sylvia. And, we've obviously heard a lot from The Guardian and the ABC, but maybe briefly you could just touch on your research more broadly and, do these kind of experiences gel with other newsrooms that you've spoken to?
Yes, and now that you mentioned critical junctures and talking about the rest of organizations in Australia, I think COVID-19 was a very important and a central sort of a situation for all the newsrooms in Australia to start automating specific processes. So, I guess for the rest of the organizations, it depends, because Australian newsrooms are marked by really specific projects for very specific ideas or journalistic intentions in every organization. So that can just vary according to different organizations. There are as I mentioned before, there are important teams working in data visualization. For example, in other companies, I'm just a little bit sort of afraid of the ethics and all these things, if I should like reveal the sources. But yeah, there are other commercial outlets.
You could speak in the general.
Yeah, in a general sense. Yeah. Or other like projects where, for example, based on the COVID-19, what they have to do was to decentralize the team and sort of like push the rest of the journalists to keep or start working with different presettings of visualization tools, so they could just start like knowing the data from COVID around the world, from the Johns Hopkins University as well, or from the state, or from the region. So there was like this decentralization of work where all journalists were more exposed, let's say, to data practices. So that's something that is happening now in the rest of the newsrooms. And I guess many journalists acknowledge that for the future it's going to be very important to focus on different data journalism practices. So yes, so to answer the question about the rest of the sector, yeah, that depends on what kind of intentions the organization has, and also the possibility of sustaining the project. That's a very important thing, and I would like to just say that automation in newsrooms probably is more feasible in the extent that the government or like the state actors are also able to be modern actors in terms of like producing these data bits. So when you talk to journalists, so I was surprised, for example, by the fact that how come Australia doesn't have like any really sophisticated like robot journalism as the wire services have, you know, like robot journalism, 300 stories produced per day, whatever. So I was just like exploring this aspect of why there is no like a model of automated production in news, especially in terms of English market that is very well developed. And part of the limitations that the organizations have is this idea of sustaining this, and also in relation to the government actors that are supposed to be sophisticated to deliver the data to journalists, which, and I'm going to just wrap up this part, and it's like, it reminds me like the idea that for specific industrialized processes of automation, there is a need of a sort of, say, like a bureaucracy of data for the governments to sort of supply organizations with this permanent and with this flow of data, no? So that's why we have like specific genres developed around finance, economics, sports, like really quantitative things going on, but we don't have like a more development in other genres. So yes, so there is like organizations and actors, also modern actors that can provide this sort of a structure between organizations and government.
So maybe a few less PDFs in the future. So, you know, the rest of our panel has been waiting patiently while we kind of focus parochially on the Australian experience, but now we move to them, and I'll bring you in, Ai-Ching. If you could maybe talk to us about the extent of automation in China around news distribution, but also news more broadly. You know, as you know, not to bring me into it too much, but as I was studying on automated news distribution, one name kept coming up, Jinli Toutiao, early on in my sort of research, and maybe you could, you know, introduce that kind of actor to us, and then take us from there.
Sure. Before I became academic, in my previous life, I was a journalist in the analog era. That hence the interest in automation, journalism, media, etc. in the Chinese context. I'm bringing you to a very different world. China has always been regarded the other, but this time it's the more advanced other, because automated decision-making AI, etc., have been used in Chinese media industry for a long time. And the Chinese media environment is very different, not just because of the CCP, not just because of the censorship, but because of its integrated media ecosystem. So there's no such a separation as broadcasting, print, digital media. It's all integrated together. And hence the digital team, the digital media, the broadcast, the mobile media, and the print, they all work as an integrated team together. And that has been going on since 2015. So lots of people in the West use Toutiao as a case study to look at how automation, particularly in terms of automated news distribution using algorithmic recommendation systems to recommend news to individual users. However, I want to use Toutiao as a case to illustrate how automated decision-making technologies and systems have been used not just in news distribution, but also in production, in content moderation, and other applications. Okay, so very briefly, some of the content on Toutiao, for example, is created by human journalists. Some come from social influencers and ordinary users, and some is written by AI reporters and editors, particularly in sports. So we all know, as everywhere in the world, automated writing by AI mostly working, is mostly seen when they work with structured data. And hence in the Chinese context as well, in 2015, that's when first AI editor and AI writer was employed by Tencent to write on sports in 2015, and then writing on finance, because you deal with all the Excel spreadsheets. So, and then Toutiao actually started using bot, it's called the Xiaoming bot, to write automated sports news during the 2016 Olympic Games. And that trend has taken up since then. Now every year, whenever there's bigger sporting events, you see hundreds of thousands of articles written by AI editors and reporters. And in 2022, earlier this year, the Winter Olympic Games, also they have employed not just the bot writing news reports, but also AI anchor persons to deliver the news, and the AI hand sign language interpreters. So instead of having multiple sign language interpreters doing the job, they have AI there 24 hours a day doing it. Of course, the human interpreters are still used in other sessions, but in terms of news broadcasting, it's all automated. So that's in terms of news production delivery, but also when we look at news recommendation, you talk about Toutiao, how it's pioneered in using algorithmic news recommendation systems for subscribers on its platform. But I want to say, actually, that model is everywhere in the Chinese platform. It's not just Toutiao, although Toutiao is the first one. Toutiao is owned by ByteDance. ByteDance is the company that owns TikTok. Okay, so that kind of recommendation system has been used by all Chinese news channels, news platforms, news organizations. And they have all used the same kind of, we call that personalization or Toutiaoization kind of systems in news distribution and recommendation systems. It's a defining character and element of the Chinese online news ecosystem. And it's core for their revenue generation. And for state-sponsored media organizations, it was key for boosting their relevance and attention. Again, when it comes to AI and ADM+S in news, they face similar kind of problems like, echo chambers, filter bubbles, and algorithmic bias. But what's different in the Chinese case that China has taken action to regulate AI algorithm. So it's not just the platforms you can use the AI algorithm for news production, distribution, etc. But actually, the government says there are parameters how far you can go with your algorithm. It has to be regulated. I won't go into further details because that's kind of new. The algorithm regulation law is recently, in March this year, became effective. So there are parameters as to how you can use your parameter to regulate your recommendation and whether users have the right to turn off, to switch off from these recommendation systems. So what's unique about Toutiao also is its partnership with the Chinese state to promote official agenda. Whenever you talk about Chinese news, inevitably you talk about the CCP's influence, of course. On Toutiao and the other news platforms, the biggest news headlines still dominate the top of the homepage. It doesn't matter whether you turn on or off the recommendation system or not. When it comes to important so-called hard news, you don't have any option. It's not personal. It's not personalized. Everybody gets the same thing. It's only when you have the option to turn off personalized recommendations, systems in terms of softer news, entertainment, sports, lifestyle, etc. The so-called non-headline news and the stories. So hence, the algorithm regulation can be seen as an effort to break the filter bubbles and unite the nation in an intelligent system of shared information and common value recognized by the party state. It has two levels of significance. One is so-called, what they call the adding value to AI in journalism. So we in the West, when we talk about AI in the ADM+S, we talk about ethics. In the Chinese context, it's not about ethics, it's about adding value. And who defines the value? Of course, the party state defines the value. So to use recommendation algorithms to boost mainstream media and their authority in the battle against COVID-19, for example. And the second, they use algorithm to evaluate and guide public opinion. So it's not just giving you what you want, but actually giving you what we think what you want, but nudging you. The algorithmic nudging is used to give you what they think you should know and you should be moving towards in the name of giving you what you want. So that's the second point I want to talk about when it comes to that kind of regulation of algorithm. And the third, another point I'd like to point out, which everybody else has not talked about so far, is about using algorithm, ADM+S, to fight misinformation. Because misinformation, particularly in the digital era, is everywhere. And fighting the fake news is really a political agenda for Chinese digital platforms nowadays, as Beijing tightens grip on online content and the big tech. So the Toutiao, for example, have been fronted by the Chinese regulatory authorities a few times, just like our parliamentary hearing on social media and misinformation. And in China, it's the same. They asked the government authorities, regulatory authorities, asked Toutiao to take actions to do something about all the misinformation, particularly in relation to COVID-19, the vaccine, misinformation, etc. So Toutiao, of course, has taken actions to close down accounts, to also encourage users to report misleading stories. And also another thing is they use AI to train fake news, anti-fake news identification. So they have two AI systems. One AI is to identify fake news, the other one to generate fake news. And they pit these two against each other to see which one works better and then to optimize both. So, AI is, the point is, you just use AI to produce news, to moderate news. Of course, moderation of news on Chinese social media platforms and in Chinese news organizations is a common problem, right? And everybody talks about it. I'm not going to go into censorship. But the thing is, they use AI to identify, to produce fake news. That kind of optimized fake news identification I find it very interesting. So the last point I want to point it out is how in the Chinese media system, the platforms and the private AI companies are very close collaborators of the Chinese government. So, and they're very close collaborators with Chinese flagship media organizations. So they don't just operate separately. China Central Television, for example, doesn't have to go around to look for developers, machine learning experts, etc., because China has a vibrant AI industry. So Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, iFlyTech, SenseTime, you name it, Huawei, etc., you name it. There are so many big tech companies who are more than willing to help, to offer their help, and this comprehensive help. And they help CCTV, for example, China Central Television, to develop their AI-generated content. It's called aigc.cctv.com, which is a kind of very comprehensive news center that provides one-stop service for all Chinese government-sponsored news organizations in automation, news production, etc., and sharing. So I think I'll stop here. But one last line is, I would say, automated journalism in the Chinese context is ultimately the result of a human effort and a human decision-making. AI-powered computational systems in journalism are far from objective partners. They are conditioned by their specific technological cultures within their social context and with very different values. That's it, thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Haiqing. That's a wonderful overview of, obviously a country where what we've discussed earlier, things have just kind of moved at a much faster pace. Obviously, additional capacity from the government, from those other technological partners has supported that. And that point about regulation, although maybe we want to continue Malavika's provocation to avoid law and policy and to have had some more coffee. It's really great to see how those kind of emerging challenges around regulation you kind of flagged as well. Vibke, we'll bring you into the conversation now, and obviously, as an expert, particularly in the German experience, could you perhaps talk more about the German context, perhaps even European context? To what extent are newsrooms embracing technology there? And obviously, just wanting to flag your concept of pioneering journalism, which, perhaps plays a conceptual role in these kinds of discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I can't deliver a country report for Germany. So to be honest, I would say what a discussion in Germany would pretty similar sound like we have discussed here the case in Australia. So definitely we will have one journalist from public service broadcasting on the panel, one from a big newspaper, for example, because these are the big newsrooms that are able to work with these kind of technologies, that have the resources, that are doing a lot of experimenting with these kind of technologies. So that I would say is pretty similar. I also heard a lot about, of course, COVID-19 and what this does to automation. And in that particular case, I learned a new word, so to say, and that was in the automatable product in journalism. So, and pretty similar what you described from the ABC. So how can we build automatable products? And thinking of journalistic products in terms of dashboards, for example. So when it comes to all these different numbers, how do they fly in and so on and so forth. And why do I strengthen that point? So that is really a new kind of product. And when it comes to journalism and journalism research, so I've been doing journalism research for over 20 years now. And when I started to talk to these pioneering journalists in the field, so those people who are working with this technology, for example, in the first place, I didn't understand what they told me. So they talked about products and tools, and during my first interviews, I thought, so you should know what they talk about, but to be honest, I didn't get it. So, and then I thought, you are a researcher, you have the obligation to ask questions, and I asked back, so what do you mean when you talk about products? What do you mean when you talk about tools? And then I learned that in the field there are totally different understandings what a tool is, what a product is, what a technology is, what AI is, what machine learning is, to what end it's useful, and so on and so forth. I think that is very important when we're talking about automation in journalism, to step at least 2 or 5 or 10 steps back and think about what we are talking about. And even in the news organizations, so the editorial teams, or the normal editors, so to say, and the tech-savvy staff, they don't understand each other. So, and that is a very serious problem in news organizations, and I think that is not only the case in Germany, but around the world, because automation, machine learning, technological development, that is something that is very internationally oriented. Of course, you have these different media systems, different cultures, different understandings of all these things, but when it comes to technology development, that is in itself internationally oriented. So, and when you talk to pioneer journalists, so why do we use the word pioneer journalist in that research project you mentioned? So it's not pioneer in the sense, so it comes from botanic. So we have pioneering plants are plants that grow in areas where no other plants would grow. And there the idea comes from. So what do have these plants have that they can grow on that particular surface, for example? That is where the analogy comes from. And the idea, if you talk to pioneering actors in the field, you will get a better sense of what the future will be like. So this is not to say that the imaginations, pioneering actors in the field, and a lot of these pioneering actors talk about possibilities of how to automate journalism, that will be exactly the case 10 years later, but at least you get a sense of what could be the case and what is about to move from these experimenting fields to the core of journalism, or to the center of journalism. And data journalism is a very good example for understand that. So for understanding that, so 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, data journalism was not part of everyday journalism, but today data journalism is part of everyday journalism. So, and COVID makes that extremely clear. And if we want to understand that, that is also not only looking at the side of producers, but also looking at the side of audiences. They also need to get used to understand and read all these kinds of data. Come back to the German case. So I think, again, when it comes to automation in journalism, it is crucial to understand, I would say, 3 things. So, and I think that is the case around the world where news organizations deal with automation. So the first, or with automated decision making or algorithms or whatever. So the first thing is AI, automation, algorithms, big data, you name it, is a topic that needs to be covered in journalism. So even without automation. It is a very important topic for society. So there comes the plus in your name of the center. And so it is an important topic on its own, and journalism and journalists need to cover that topic critically. So that, first of all, I would say is important when it comes to AI and automation. Second, it changes journalism and the practices in journalism from within. We heard that in all these different examples. So, and in different stages of the news circle. When it comes to research and verification, I prefer the term observation. So it changes the ways journalists observe society. You more and more observe society by means of data. And that really is a change, not to say that data or hasn't been part of journalism since many, many years. So when it comes to election, for example, but as you study that in the ADM+S Center, so the society becomes datafied as a whole. And you see that reflected in all these different editorial departments. So changes journalism from within in all this. In all the news circle aspects, so observation, production, distribution, of course, and usage, and making sense of follow-up communication. You mentioned that, so AI is also used, or machine learning, in making sense out of user comments. So it affects the whole news circle. And third, we are not talking about automation in factories. So robots left the factory a long time ago. So automation is no longer anymore about building things, but today automation is about automating communication. And when it comes to journalism, that means it's about automating communicative labor. And communication is the fuel societies operate on. And that is why I think it is so important to talk about the automation of communicative labor in a society that itself becomes more and more automated. And that makes, I would say, journalism and news such an important and particular use case for automation. Yeah.
Thanks, Wiebke. Some really great, obviously some gestures to the German example, but also some really great sort of overarching points we can take forward both in this conversation, but also the Q&A to follow. Damiano, you've been waiting patiently down the end of the chair line. Despite that, the wait, this is a really, great kind of moment to bring you in, because I think often when we speak about news, in many ways, maybe we've moved beyond the desktop, but we often still maybe think of the mobile. And I know your work is very much focused on a technology that's, come into a lot of homes, but maybe it's still not our first go-to when we think about news distribution in particular. And that's the smart speaker and the voice technology. And I guess, as well, we've kind of started in the newsroom with Nick, Inga and Sylvia, and we're now moving to Haijing and Wiebke's kind of more broader social outlook. I guess we can now also turn to the consumer end, perhaps, and the distribution end, and think about, and you could perhaps tell us about what it is about the smart speaker that brings particular opportunities, but also challenges when it comes to automation.
Yeah, thanks, James, for inviting me, and I feel privileged to be in this panel and learning a lot from my colleagues today. I work in the field of information retrieval that, to put it in a few words, looks at how different users access information, the right information in the right context, in terms of time and location. And just to give you an example, if you type a query in a search engine today and you type ADM+S, you are giving to the system just 4 characters. Probably the system will give you the web page of automated decision-making and society. Maybe if it's smart enough because it has access to the location. Many people are typing that from Melbourne, and this time of the day, you might get the program of the symposium. Now, let's imagine that another user in September, there's another event, let's say the Australian Document Management Symposium, and you get the same 4 characters. The search engine needs to go back to the huge documents in the web, that is tons and tons of documents that are daily generated, and give you that piece of information that you want. And the system might not give you, the search engine might not give you the right answer, but it will give you, in milliseconds, you will have a Star Trek board, command board, where you can see the query reformulations or related queries that might help you to let the system understand the information need that you have. And then the ranking of search results, maybe some cards. And now let's think of what you would get in a smart speaker. And I like the analogy of thinking of getting that Star Trek command board and using a straw to make that linear, because the audio communication channel is linear. and that's the communication channel that we are using today. And also, if I give you 5 seconds to summarize what you heard so far, you'll probably have a very memory load, and you will probably summarize the last bits that we had, and then if you have more time, you'll reflect and give me a better summary. No? So when we talk about voice interactions and how we access interaction via voice, we have that challenge of being able to communicate, and many times very complex information, in such a limited bandwidth channel, which is audio. No? If we think about how technology evolved in the last decade and how systems are able to understand what we say when we speak to a device and get answers on that, it's pretty amazing. No? So even if with my Italian-Argentinian broken accent, if I use and I speak to my device in English, if the type of information need is easier to understand to the system, I'll get an answer. If you ask about the weather in Melbourne, which is cold, you'll get probably an accurate answer. But now, if you go to more complex information needs, so that is where the system might struggle, no? And then might tell you, well, actually, I'm not sure. I'll redirect you to the screen. So we did some work in understanding how voice interaction, to model how users interact with the search engines in voice interactions. We call it spoken conversational search. And depending on which contents and which information need, you might have different types of ways of giving the right information in that particular context to the different users. No? For instance, we did some work on looking at podcast search. And if you think about podcasts, so it's an audio documents that you have there, and you have the opportunity to give back kind of snippets, no, of those audio documents that is back in audio. No? So if you think of using systems that allow you to interact with podcasts, so it's more natural to use a voice assistant than having a screen in that case. No? There are other challenges that, so when I refer to the analogy of the straw, so there are many signals that we get when we communicate, when we interact with the screen, that we don't necessarily have in audio. No? So, for instance, the keyword highlighting that we use in the interface of the search engine. So how do you highlight keywords or highlight snippets in audio? No? So we did some work in collaboration with Google Zurich to understand how we can change the pitch or the emphasis of the words when the system is speaking back to see if we can actually help the user understand that a particular piece of audio is more important than or more relevant than others. There are also benefits of using audio. No? So if you think of the naturalness of the interaction, so audio, there are words that shows that the way, so instead of giving 4 characters, we might speak and give more natural language input to the system, which might be richer to understand what the user wants to know, and then the system might have more information to give the relevant information there. I think in the context of news, one of the interesting things, when you think about the smart speaker, so behind the scenes of the smart speaker, is like when we say the algorithm. No? So there are so many components and so the anatomy of that technology is very complex. And if you think about news consumption through audio, so even how to generate the news, how do you generate the news that is possible to be listened through that smart speaker, is very unlikely that you will get a completely automatic way of doing that from text and summarizing that using AI or an automated system to then deliver a content that aligns with the values and the editorial of that particular source of information. No? So one of the challenges as well of using the straw and the linear channel is from what is in the backend, that is many different documents. When you deliver that information through audio, so how do you communicate to the user where that information is coming from? Especially if you start doing things like synthesis, no? Or multiple document summarization. So how do you keep track and how do you communicate that to the user, that where that information is coming from? That's why I believe that there are opportunities to have this. I think it's really like a good example of how you can have automated systems in the newsroom to generate those things that are going to be then consumed in audio. No? So I don't see in the future having a completely automatic pipeline to generate news that are delivered for smart speaker without having editors and journalists in the loop. And arguably, if you think of having automatizing or having automation in the newsroom, will probably generate more jobs than reduce jobs, no? Because we will probably need more skills to be able to generate that information that then will be accessed on different audio channels, or different channels like screens and audio.
Fantastic, thank you, Damiano. I feel it's quite apt that you were highlighting on the end of the panel because, you know, we've spoken about the very near future, of VIPCA as well, I suppose, with the pioneering journalism, but, you know, you latter three have really kind of set the scene for the kind of far future in a way, whether it's, you know, the pioneering journalism or the kind of advances in China or your work with voice technology. I think it's really gesturing to some of the, not just near, but future challenges associated with ADM and news. Now, I've been quite selfish and asked all my questions, but there's obviously a lot of people online and a lot of people in this room who might have questions of their own. So we've got a roving mic in the room, and obviously I've got access to the Zoom chat, so feel free to raise a hand or pop in a question in the chat, and yeah, we'll go from there. Yeah, we've got one there. And maybe as per the previous session, if you could just introduce yourself if you haven't already.
Hi, I'm Jose Miguel. I'm a research fellow at the Center at the University of Sydney. And I was wondering, like hearing from the different experiences and thinking about from kind of my background on the regulatory side of use of automated decision-making systems, is it these rules that we have now for media and media content, when we move to newspapers or any kind of journalism activity that is meant to reflect some degree of objectivity, are the rules that we have right now that we have developed for each society, so I'm assuming are very different in China than obviously in Germany or Australia, are they suited to this kind of automated generation of content, or are kind of the people that design the tools ultimately responsible, or is there anything else that we could be doing to start thinking about these things? Thank you.
Great, thank you. He wants to take that.
So I can say at least something on that. When it comes to journalism and all the regulations, the obligations, and all the rights journalists have, so that is all related to humans. So to a human that has the attention to public something, to make something publicly available. And it is, I think it's an extremely important question. So if rights and obligations can also pass over to these technologies, if we see them as journalistic actors to some extent, maybe the examples we have heard today, we are not there yet, maybe, but to be honest, we don't yet fully understand to which extent the human in the loop or the journalist in the loop, and you said, so who is doing that work in the end? How much journalistic agency and authority is in these processes in the end? So from the data generation, from the the processing with the data. So does a journalist understand what a system is inside is operating, and is that necessary to that he or she understands it, and which stage of the process? And is it also the case that, or could it be the case that a news item produced by a machine, by a so-called robot journalist, is also protected or not? Yeah? Does that also falls under the right of freedom of speech in the end? So that may sound strange, but I think these are important questions when it comes to media regulation and law, in particular case of journalism. So I'm not a lawyer, so I'm familiar with some of the discussions, but yeah, I think we need to discuss that or begin to understand that in the field actors become active that are non-humans, and how does that relates to the regulations we already have.
Thanks, Vivka. I don't know if anybody else has a brief comment on that question.
I have a comment, and it's really brief, and again, going back in what the governments need to do or like regulate. Definitely, I think probably access to data is very important. Open access. I guess sort of like the institutions right now are still also in transition, especially observing the case of COVID-19, where journalists struggle with sort of covering data from their homes, from Zoom, and some of them couldn't just report on the streets, but just having all the information arriving to their computers. It's like this idea of open source, that it was very difficult, and many of the journalists that I interview mentioned during the COVID-19. So it's like, I'm just trying to answer the question in terms of how governments, state need to work a little bit more on this new model of relation between media and news media and themselves. So it's very important to guarantee, and I think this is not a problem of Australia, it's a problem like all around the world. So if you go to Latin America, all the journalists are just struggling with the same issues, no? It's like we need access, we need data. So that's a good thing, and I mean, like, that's a good thing for journalists because they are like sort of creative in terms of how they get the data. So they said the best stories are the stories that we don't have the data immediately, no, in terms of journalistic coverage. But again, it's like sort of the institutions seem to be not prepared for this sort of a new relation between these two actors. I don't know if maybe journalists here can comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, Ingo, I think, were you going to come in or no?
I was going to pick up on something, and I don't know if this really answers your question, but when you sort of said the regulatory mechanisms around objectivity, it kind of threw me a little because I was like, I don't know that it is regulated. I mean, there are regulatory, I guess, there's, you know, like the code of ethics, there's the charter at the ABC, there's all these kinds of norms and ideas that we have around journalism and striving to be objective, but I don't know that it's when I think of regulation, I guess I think more of legal regulations and rules that are really set in stone, but it's such a grey area.
I want to clarify.
Sorry, could it be quick?
Yeah, I just want to also meant it from the inside, like codes of practice that you have internally, that you have created, not only from the government perspective, but also the rules that you created for yourselves inside, or the media, across the media.
Yeah, so yes, things like the Journalist Code of Ethics, the ABC Charter, all those things, I think they definitely strive towards an ideal, but whether, you know, how close we get to that ideal and whether, you know, every story meets that is definitely a grey area. And I think automation and data is really interesting because I think there's still a sense where we regard data as being objective because it's, and automation as being objective because it's a number and it's a machine and there wasn't this human intervention, or so we think. But there always is. You know, if we look at traditional journalism, even the things, the selection of facts, the people who you interview, how you structure the story, even whether you do the story and the angle that you choose, all of that goes to your objectivity or your bias. And then in automation and decision-making and the tools we use, the numbers that you select, the tool that you've used, the methodology, how you've defined the parameters that tool will use to make the decisions, all of this is human intervention and not something that is necessarily made transparent. And so I think, you know, even when we do the COVID statistics, for instance, a really simple example is when we look at the number of active cases. So New South Wales went through a process of continually redefining what an active case was until it basically didn't have any. And so it just dropped by hundreds per week. And you needed to be a human to understand how it was redefining what an active case was, because it just had thousands of active cases. And they weren't dropping because the way it defined it meant that it actually wasn't tracking the data. So it couldn't see those numbers fall in the way that it was in every other state. It looked terrible. So I could see why they were redefining it. But it also meant the numbers made no sense. It was ridiculous. And you had to decide that. But if you were just picking at the number, looking at the number every day, it seemed objective because it was being called an active case as it was in every other state. People had some understanding then of what that was supposed to mean. But, you know, we had to ask ourselves, what number do we report then? At that point, we could still calculate the old number. And I for a while there was quite stuck on the idea of continuing to report that old number because of the consistency and because that aligned with the understanding of what that number meant. But then it just became not feasible because I was introducing more manual decision-making into the process. It meant that I had to keep calculating the number every day and then questioning it. And as they continued to change the definition, it became more and more impossible to track that old number. We had to switch. So all of that stuff is part of the human decision-making and was not objective. You know, I introduced my own decisions into that, and that was kind of pushing against New South Wales' decisions and their own biases and interests in keeping the number low. And I think that's just a small example of the way that all numbers and all tools and decisions are made in a way that questions all of those frameworks. And so I think part of the danger of that and data and automation is that we have our guard down sometimes when we look at it. Whereas I think when people read something that they think came from a human, from a journalist, and they go, oh, it came from Sky News, or it came from the ABC, or it came from Fox News, and they have a kind of a sense of what they think about that and what they think about the objectivity and the bias and the ethics of the journalist that produced that. But when it comes from a machine, I don't know that we have that same regard and the same kind of defenses that we have that mean that we are more critical in the analysis of and the receipt of that information. And really, that is probably what we need to have, that deeper understanding that means that we can regard that information and assess it and critique it in the way that we would human-produced information.
I can very quickly add something from the German case. So one of the first newsrooms in Germany, the News and Automation Lab from the Bavarian public service broadcasters, they just released a guideline for responsible use of AI. So as far as I know, that is one of the first guidelines in the field. So, and I guess it could be also available in English. So I'm not sure, but could be, yeah.
Fantastic. So we've got a question from Zoom, which is great, from Diana Bossio at Swinburne University. And she asked to the panel, I guess, how might particular cultures around journalism or particular ideologies around journalism as a profession, so views about what journalism is supposed to do, or I guess interpreting a kind of question, cultures in newsrooms and so on, provide challenges and opportunities for adoption and inclusion of automation in journalism?
I can say something from the very outlier point of view. But I think one of the interesting questions is about using automation in the newsroom is like, who is going to develop that technology and how then can adapt that in the particular needs of different newsrooms. No? So there's a question of adapting off-the-shelf technologies in your particular needs, and that's who is going to do that, no? And how much it costs to do that. I think that's why I said like will probably generate more jobs than reduce, because you will need in that newsroom someone that can make sense of what can be done and how you can personalize the functionality that you could have from off the shelf. So obviously the large organization might develop their in-house technology, but most of the times the newsroom will probably adopt existing technology developed somewhere else, and you will need to personalize because different newsrooms will have different needs. And that's where it links like the editorial and the ideology or the different personalization of the voice of that particular newsroom.
Does anybody else have anything to add on that question?
I think what we often forget when it comes to this issue in technologies is that it is also implemented in newsrooms. And what I hear a lot of these innovation teams is they say, so 80% of our workload is talking to people, talking to editors, and to convince them or to better make understandable what these tools are could be used for. And we shouldn't forget that implementing technology is a social process. And there's also a lot of fear of being replaced in newsrooms. So by normal editors, so to say, that are not so tech savvy. And that is also part of this development. We shouldn't forget that. It's extremely important, I would say.
We've got a question at the front from Mark.
Thanks for a really interesting panel. This is a topic that James and I have been talking about some, and others in the center too, and it gets to the role that platforms play in curating the distribution of news. And you know, if we think about the proliferation of outlets, automated generation of content, the real bottleneck in terms of news consumption becomes kind of the attentional capacity or the informational capacity of the consumer, which means that curation plays such an important role in getting the type of news coverage that folks on the panel are working on out to people. In Australia, the News Media Bargaining Code has to some extent further enshrined the role of platforms as really playing an economic role in supporting journalism. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about what it means to rely on the automated decisions that are made by those systems in order to get your content out, especially as they change their systems, right? You know, Facebook decides it's going to tweak its algorithm and all of a sudden all the circulation changes, or I don't know, TikTok comes along with a new algorithm and it changes the logics of how information circulates. So, you know, Hai-Ching was talking about some of the ways in which the state might intervene to curate the information that people see. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the role of commercial curation and other possible alternatives. And I think it's interesting that we've got representatives from both a public service media organization and a commercial one. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts.
Nick, do you want to?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I actually found the China example quite interesting because one thing that you mentioned was the algorithmically generated presentation of the content increased their revenue, I think. You said something like that. But it's interesting, in Australia, a lot of the media organisations have pushed back against algorithmic presentation of the actual news website. So rather than kind of leaning into that personalisation for everyone, you know, you see, you know, for example, maybe you go to the website and you see the most tailored news for you or something like that. It's not that at all. It's like editorial control, top to bottom. Here's real people, choose what you see. that sort of thing. And there were experiments with, you know, algorithmic presentation of news websites, and there still are here and there, but really there was like a pushback against it, which I find quite interesting, where in other countries it's gone the other way. And I don't really know why, so it'd be interesting to find out why. I'm sure there's a good reason. I think, like, you know, editors really want to emphasize what they think is the most important news, and you don't necessarily get that on the other platforms. Apple News went the human-curated way, which is interesting as well. So they have actual editors who pick the content. I don't know if there's, you know, a mix of algorithms in there as well. But then you've got Facebook, which is all algorithmically generated, and Google News, which is all algorithmically generated. So it's a real mix, and it'd be interesting to get all of those things together and see what the different outcomes of those are. Would make a great research project for someone. As a journalist, it's obviously preferable to be able to tell people, here's the most important thing that we think you should be reading, and all that sort of stuff. Every now and then you'll get an email from, you know, your mum or your friend's parents or something like that, because something has gone viral that you didn't know about, and it's like, you know, doing the rounds on Facebook or something like that. So it's not always the things that you expect will be high on those platforms that works well, even though we have people at news organizations whose entire job it is to, you know, optimize for distribution and all that sort of stuff, and, you know, understand these platforms as well as you can. You can't always predict what happens. And this has been discussed a lot, but, you know, it's worth saying, of course, that you can't rely on these platforms too much. There's the infamous pivot to video, which happened with a lot of sites when Facebook said, we're going to prioritize video in the feeds. Some, like, news organizations and sort of went very hard on that and said, we're going to do lots of video now. You know, we're retooling our staff and systems to kind of concentrate on video. We're going to make more money off Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. That didn't work out. It was a disaster. And yeah, so it's a great example of why you shouldn't necessarily rely on these platforms. You have to build your own audiences, you have to build your own distribution channels and all that sort of stuff that you can control a lot better, speaking as an organization. Not that I'm an organization. Or speak on behalf of The Guardian.
Good save. I feel quite sad doing this because it's such a fascinating question, but we have come to time. We'll just say that lunch is in the foyer, and we'll let you know that there are poster presentations in this room in half an hour. But before we do go to the foyer, could you please join me in thanking such a wonderful panel who provided their insights today. And thanks to everybody online. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Already over. Yeah.